Salam to all of you. Welcome again to my contemporary US political thought and foreign policy class. This is part 2 of lecture 10 titled The Domino Theory and US Global Interventionism. Following up on what we said in part 1, we shall now try to assess and appraise the domino theory in the context of US military interventions during the Cold War. We're going to see what conclusions we can draw about the impact this theory had on US political decision making and the American political process in general. As a matter of fact, the outcome of both the Korean War and the Vietnam War revealed that the domino theory fell short of fulfilling its hefty promises to US officials with regard to the way they conducted US foreign policy during the Cold War. And there are four major aspects, or if you want, four major reasons to that failure. One thing was that the domino theory was anchored on a faulty self-serving national mythology, and this ultimately led to miscalculated interventions like those in Korea and Vietnam. Because of this faulty mythology, the United States failed to learn the right lessons from previous experiences, and therefore failed to adequately weigh up the risks and consequences of military interventions. And this faulty national mythology can be summed up in the following points. The United States was driven by the myth that it was the only country responsible for the defense of the free world, and that it was justified in its military interventions in the internal conflicts of both countries. Korea and Vietnam showed, however, that when pushed to its final trenches, the United States usually becomes more concerned about avoiding a humiliating defeat and about saving its image and its reputation than about really protecting dominoes from falling. We have also the arrogant assumption that the United States was superior to the rest of the world. One of President Kennedy's advisors summed up this assumption in the following words, quote, "The United States was the locomotive at the head of mankind and the rest of the world the caboose," unquote. To US officials, no power in the world could resist their country's technological, financial and cultural supremacy, and certainly not what President Johnson pejoratively called, quote, "a raggedly ass fourth-rate country," unquote. This was, by the way, in reference to Vietnam. And finally, the United States was haunted by the belief that its power, tenacity and competency to defend its allies were constantly being tested, not just in Korea and Vietnam, but the world over. Now, this belief prevented its leaders from detecting certain truths that, if exploited in time, could have perhaps led to better outcomes. And we shall see some of those truths in a minute. The domino theory failed also because the political thought and reasoning that lay behind it were sometimes flawed. Policymakers were often guided by flawed premises. For example, successive American administrations failed to understand that different political movements or countries adopted communism for a variety of reasons, and that communism was not made of an indivisible group with a common purpose working for one definite objective. In fact, Asian communists were often driven more by nationalism and the commitment to national independence than by what George Kennan once called global, quote-unquote, schematic ideological expansionism. The US political establishment also, by and large, failed to understand that the wars in both Korea and Vietnam had resulted from two rival nationalisms, nurtured by Cold War arrangements, leading to the partition of the two countries after World War II. In reality, they were simply internal, or if you want, local conflicts, and not, as they were presented, test case global conflicts or international wars. US officials showed fanatic concern about the communism of North Korea and North Vietnam and their leaders, but granted no importance to their nationalistic identities. They actually took Asian communism out of its immediate local context and erroneously gave it a global dimension. Blinded by cliché judgment like zero tolerance, zero appeasement, full victory, and so on, the US political establishment actually failed to adequately interpret the local circumstances and grasp the full picture of what was at stake in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere. And finally, the absence of free and contradictory debate within the immediate circles of power, especially in the context of the McCarthyist purge of dissident voices, meant that no alternatives to the official vision were allowed to emerge. And that official vision would thus come out as the irrefutable truth. And this means that the necessary questions were never asked by American decision makers. One of those fundamental questions that should have been asked, which were not, was: were there any other options in the handling of those conflicts other than the military option that caused all such failures? In addition to its military and political failures, the domino theory, which guided US foreign policy for nearly half a century, brought forth a moral, or if you want, a propaganda disaster, especially in Vietnam. US officials, for example, often claimed that the United States was a moral crusader against the evil that was represented, according to them, by international communism. But the US roguish conduct in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere actually discredited that claim and seriously damaged the country's international image. The United States always claimed that it was thrust with the moral responsibility to defend humanity against brutality. But as it is shown in the pictures here, the indiscriminate massacres it committed against civilians in Vietnam did actually consume much of its moral assets and erode its reputation. Another dark spot in the US foreign policy record during the Cold War era was its relentless support for corrupt authoritarian regimes against the will of their people. Korea and Vietnam were typical examples. This is to be added, of course, to its alliance with the colonialist powers against the legitimate aspirations of the colonies, and its support for France's repressive policies in Algeria is an illustrative case in point. Inside the United States, the TV pictures of those successes caused large-scale social unrest and serious damage to the national psyche and national self-esteem. Abroad, those successes sparked huge anti-American protests in the four corners of the world. In the picture here, you can see, for example, the imposing anti-Vietnam War rally in London in 1968. US management of the Korean War and the Vietnam War was largely marred by a number of strategic dysfunctions, miscalculations, and deficiencies. And those opened the way for all sorts of missteps with serious and enduring consequences. One of those deficiencies was the fact that the US entered both wars with an overambitious, if not jingoistic, objective, which was, quote-unquote, military victory and nothing else. But with time, it ended up being contented with a modest objective of, quote-unquote, limited victory, and eventually with the face-saving Peace of the Brave overture. Failure to achieve victory in both wars, despite the colossal means which were deployed, dealt a terrible blow to a number of American strategic theses, and these included world hegemony, containment, and of course the domino effect. The domino theory failed militarily because the United States was defeated despite being far superior in military hardware and financially to North Vietnam. The domino principle also failed politically because the successive administrations which enthusiastically implemented it on the ground eventually failed to prevent more dominoes from falling. Not only did South Vietnam turn communist, but it also dragged with it the neighboring countries, namely Laos and Cambodia. In his memoirs, Secretary of Defense under Johnson, Robert McNamara, pertinently outlined what he regarded as the major lessons to learn from the Vietnam War. And here is one of them. Quote, "We did not recognize that neither our own people nor our leaders are omniscient. Where our own security is not directly at stake, our judgment of what is in another people's or country's best interests should be put to the test of open discussion in international forums. We do not have the God-given right to shape every nation in our own image or as we choose." Unquote. In conclusion, let me close this lecture with the following remarks. US military interventions, in accordance with the domino theory, caused the loss of millions of lives and trillions of dollars. American interventions, whether direct, by proxy, or through clandestine operations, often ended in failure. In addition to Korea and Vietnam, the United States directly intervened in many countries in the world throughout the Cold War era. And the list is pretty long. Iran, Congo, Cuba, Laos, Indonesia, Congo, Ghana, Cambodia, Chile, Angola, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Grenada, the Philippines, and Panama. But despite its evident multidimensional failure, the domino theory was to continue to guide, or if you want misguide, American political thought and foreign policy even after the Cold War. With the historic collapse of communism, the American political establishment simply couldn't part with the domino effect mindset. In fact, it wasted no time to conveniently find a new ideological adversary in order to justify its policy of global interventionism. Now, as far as the reading assignment is concerned, this week we have two major journal articles. We can find, in fact, you can find the details on the platform. So that's it. I hope you stay safe.